Morning, everyone. Great to have you here this morning. It's a beautiful day in Waterbury Center, Vermont, where I am coming from and seeing you from here this morning. And most importantly, I hope that you are all safe and healthy wherever you may be calling in from this morning. And thanks for taking the time to be with us. As Lisa said, I'm a conservation biologist and also a forester, a Vermont licensed forester with Audubon, Vermont. And we are the state program of the National Audubon Society. Folks are familiar with Audubon as an organization. We're a bird conservation organization and more broadly, a conservation organization that uses birds to think about the landscape and what we do out there and how our actions as people sharing the landscape with those birds, what the implications are for birds and other wildlife. And simply speaking, our mission of Audubon is to protect birds in the places they need today and tomorrow. And ultimately, those are the same places that we need as people. So that's a little bit about the organization. I work specifically with all of our forest-based bird conservation programs. So I administer and manage and I'm also in the field to help landowners, both private landowners and public land managers, to think about how do we bring bird habitat into our thoughts and our management and planning around the places that we take care of and that we steward, and have been doing that here at Audubon. I've been with Audubon for 21 years and focused on forest management type things, forest bird conservation for the last 15 of those years. So it's a great pleasure to be out in the woods every day, particularly in the summer, to meet with people, talk about birds, and kind of do what we're doing today. I'll say that this is, given the situation that we're in right now here in the world, this kind of a conversation that we're going to have, this is new for me to sit here and imagine, I've got my coffee here. So this is very informal. I'm kind of thinking this like we're sitting across from each other at some nice cafe out with outdoor tables. And we're just kind of drinking our coffee or tea or milk or water or juice or whatever it is that we have. And I don't have a presentation. This is very open, free form for folks to bring their questions that they have about birds and bird habitat and how we can think about birds when we're out there on the land. So that's what we're here to do. And I hope that we will have a rich conversation about bird conservation. That's a mouthful. Bird and coffee and conservation conversation. You say that 3 times fast. I bet some of the young folks here could do that much quicker than I could. So thanks for coming. And I guess, Lisa, you're gonna basically share some of the questions that are in the chat box, and we'll have a talk about them.
So while we're waiting for a few questions to pop in, Steve, can you tell me a little bit about what you're seeing, how this spring is going, what we should be thinking about as we are getting out into nature? Yeah,
absolutely. With all of the things that are happening in the world right now and uncertain about what tomorrow might look like, I find personally that there's a lot of comfort in being out in the natural world, particularly here in the springtime, because things in the natural world are going along as they have been. And that includes a lot of our migratory birds returning back here to Vermont, which will be there, for some of them will be where they are going to attempt to nest and raise the next generation of their species. Other birds that are moving into Vermont right now are just stopping over for a rest as they continue further north to wherever they might be going for their breeding territory. So here in the mid-May, we're kind of at that point where I would say migration has kicked off in high gear, but not necessarily high gear in terms of the number of birds that have been moving through just yet. So we've seen quite a few of the species that we're accustomed to, but it seems like the numbers of those birds are not up to what they might be for this time of year in mid-May. And I think one of the reasons for that is simply, I don't know, has anybody seen snow in the last couple of days? All right, so the weather has not been that great, and weather definitely has an influence and factors into when birds are moving, how far they're moving, things like that. So they're very, very reliant upon it. So that's the long part of it answering your question, Lisa. The short answer is, so where I am in Waterbury Center, I've been out to some of the forest around me because forest is near and dear to my heart. So I have seen and heard some of our common songbirds, things like ovenbirds, black-throated green warblers, black-throated blue warblers, birds that we tend to find, many of which will stay right here in the forest and will try to nest, and some of them are going to continue on further north. Here around where my house is, we live on an old 9-acre farmstead, so there's some open land. We have our phoebes, our eastern phoebes, which is a flycatcher. They were one of the earliest ones to arrive, and they say their name. They Phoebe, so we know that they're around. They're nesting up under the eaves of our barn, which is kind of cool to see. We've got plenty of song sparrows here, plenty of northern cardinals around here as well. We did see a Scarlet Tanager. My family did, my wife and my kids saw a Scarlet Tanager in our lilacs 2 weeks ago. And that's not a bird that typically we find here during the summer because we don't have a lot of heavy forest cover, and that bird likes more heavy forest cover. So I suspect it was just resting here on its way somewhere else in migration. But so that, there's quite a few of the birds we would expect to see, just not the numbers of them at this point. And I do believe, though, that tonight and even last night, there probably were some good movements. And I'm saying night, too, because these songbirds that I'm really giving most reference to are migrating. They are moving at night as opposed to the day. So if you think about, gee, I've never been outside on a nice spring morning and seen flocks of little songbirds moving through the sky. And that's because during the day, those birds are down on the ground, they're resting, they're moving around here and there looking for food. And then come a good favorable weather conditions at night, they will get up and continue their migration further north to wherever they might be going, which is different than hawks. We think about hawks and geese, things that we see during moving in the daytime. So the songbirds are a little different in terms of how they migrate and when they migrate.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I've actually already seen a brood of geese here in the Champlain Valley. So they've already actually hatched some of their young already. So things are happening.
Yeah.
Let me relay a question here. So I'm going to kind of go with two questions. Before you answer, let me finish both. So Luna wants to know why the female red-breasted grosbeak is a feeder hog. And then someone else wanted to know about feeding birds. They said they feed birds all winter long, but they were told they shouldn't feed them other than hummingbirds right now. Should they be bringing their feeders in?
Great questions. I'm going to start with the second one about bird feeding and when to feed. So bird feeding is a wonderful activity that has multiple benefits. One is that it allows us during the winter months to be able to see birds that happen to be overwintering here, or maybe even moved down south to Vermont from a more northern place for the winter, which that sometimes happens too. So it's a way for us to appreciate and see what birds happen to be in our area. Secondly, it does also provide important food resource benefits, obviously, to those birds that are looking for them. Birds can find food, on their own. The seeds that are out there on plants, and even some fruits, berries that are still hanging on, things like staghorn sumac being an example of that. So they can still find food, but it is helpful for us to provide it. But importantly, it is really critical for us to think about when we're doing that. So the time of year that we recommend people bird feed is sometime after, and this is for Vermont now, I don't know if there are folks from outside of the state, after the bear have gone into their winter dormancy period until the time when they come out of that. So I'm relating our bird feeding time to when bears are active. And the reason for that is not only do birds like the feeders, but so do bears. And I'm sure we've all heard situations where bears have come to people's feeders. People have gotten some very interesting videos of bears doing some pretty acrobatic things to get at food. But that's not what we want, because what happens is that bear will likely continue to come to your feeder if you leave it up, and eventually it will be considered a nuisance bear. And then unfortunately, we sometimes have to, like Fish and Wildlife Department has to remedy that situation and move that bear out of there. So really, it's hard to give an exact timing, but I say from basically late November through the end of March is a good time to be thinking about. But when bears are either still out in the fall or coming out in the spring, we should be cognizant or aware of that and make sure that we take our feeders in once that starts happening, so that we minimize the negative unintended consequences of feeding bears as well as birds. On the question of the female rose-breasted grosbeak being a feeder hog, you know, I wouldn't necessarily say that that's something that's a given for female rose-breasted grosbeaks. You know, there are some birds I definitely know of, like blue jays, that can come in and chase everybody else away and really seem to take over the feeders. And rose-breasted grosbeaks, the females, I don't know if there's any science behind showing that they can be aggressive to feeders or not. I haven't necessarily observed that myself, so you might just have one that is overly ambitious and feeling confident when she is at your feeder. But again, hopefully that is during the winter months and not now.
Great, thanks so much. Tracy wants to know about a little bit about forest management. She says, Steve, a lot of our land is even-aged forest and the understory is almost non-existent. I note a different set of birds now that our forest is maturing. I miss the thickets and understory. What's the best way to bring that back in a way that helps birds and other wildlife?
That is an excellent question, Tracy. And I'm going to give you the answer that you're going to hate, but it's the answer I have to give in these situations, and I'll qualify that. The answer is it depends. The way to do that depends on a lot of things. It depends on how big of an area you're talking about. It depends on what types of trees are growing there and the quality of the wood. You know, are they nice and straight timber quality trees? Or are they not? So it also depends on whether you're thinking about. I'm gonna picture in my mind maybe what you are thinking about and describe it. It's a place where it might have been relatively open land, with you're standing there and it's nice and warm when the sun's shining, and you get lots of really dense growth, saplings in particular that have come in there, tree saplings. And you probably heard birds like chestnut-sided warbler, maybe American redstart, things that look for that, what we call young forest, or another term is early successional habitat. So places where there's been some kind of a disturbance to the land. And by disturbance, I mean, maybe there was an ice storm that brought down the canopy trees, or a wind event, or maybe it's where there was a harvest, a timber harvest at some point over a fairly large area of an acre or more. And then you get all this dense regrowth coming in, and you get a very specific bird community that needs that condition, that habitat condition that we call it, for its nesting habitat. And over time, so that's where this early successional part, this naming comes in, because forests are not static. They change over time. They grow, the trees grow bigger, they grow taller, and eventually they reach a point where they start to shade out all that low dense growth. And the chestnut-sided warbler says, hey, this isn't what I need, and it goes somewhere else. So if that's the kind of habitat you're inquiring about, one of the things you can do is you can go back into that same place, and you have to qualify this with, are you in Vermont's use value appraisal program or current use, and you have a management plan in place. So anything you do has to be consistent with that. If it's just a small patch around your house, you might go in and cut that back again and allow it to regrow, to maintain or bring back that early successional habitat. If you have more land, another option would be to go find a place where you've got some really low quality trees. Maybe it's an old field that grew up into some really gnarly looking white pine, and you might say, we're gonna cut this back and try to establish this habitat in a new spot. So those are, you know, some initial ideas and thoughts about what you might be looking to get back to, and some ways that you could achieve that. But really, to fully understand it requires having a someone, a natural resource professional or other knowledgeable, even a landowner that lives next to you who's familiar with these things, like a coverage cooperator, for example, who's been through the training, could come and also talk with you about that. You can also reach out to me directly via phone or email, and we'll give you that information at the end, and we can talk through it as well.
Sounds great. Patty wants to know, where do I start? What about, Birds 101? If I don't know anything, what do I do?
Yeah, so Patty, there's a couple of great resources that are out there. There's actually one, and Kathleen and Lisa, you can make sure I get this right. It's My Vermont Woods.
Our Vermont
Our
Woods.
Vermont Woods, okay, which is put out by University of Vermont Extension and Forest Parks and Recreation and other partners. They have essentially a course, online course for backyard, for people who own smaller acreage, less than 20 acres, I think is the figure that they recommend it for. And there's a whole curriculum that you can get on there. And one of the topics I know is about Birding 101, because I recorded the webinar for it. So I know that's one of the classes that you can take amongst others. There are also, depending on where you are, there are Audubon chapters around the state, which are volunteer groups that get together periodically, have meetings, have membership, and do a lot of great birding events, taking people out to local places to explore the birds that are around them. Very accessible for newcomers to join in and start to learn themselves. So really, I think the best place is to try to find someone who is willing to go out there with you and start to understand, based on the places you are, the habitats you're in, what birds are we finding here? Because being able to associate certain birds with certain habitats, I think, is a really great way to go about it. Because otherwise, there are like 260 birds that nest in Vermont, species of birds that nest in Vermont. So trying to identify that one that's singing over there can be very daunting, unless you're able to say, okay, well, I'm in a hayfield here, and I'm hearing a bird that almost sounds like R2-D2, the robot. And then you'll start to learn, well, in hayfields, there's a bird called the bobolink, and you look that up and you listen to it and you say, that's it. It sounds like R2-D2 to me. Well, it does to me. Maybe it doesn't to you. But that's certainly one way to do it. And even Audubon Vermont and our Green Mountain Audubon Center, which is our main office in Huntington, obviously not right now. We're not open and holding public events, but we do also, in addition to the Audubon chapters around the state, we host events as well to invite people to come out that are interested in learning more.
Great. I'm going to read a question from Suri, one of the students on, and she wants to know, do birds eat other birds of their own species?
Do birds eat other birds of their own species? I do not know the definitive answer to that, but I'm going to say that certainly in majority of cases they do not. I'm not going to say that it does not happen or that there are not certain species that may, but by and large, I'm not familiar with any birds that do that sort of thing. And I may also say, based on that response, which is a very unsatisfying response for me to not really know, but I'm going to just tell you that I don't know. If anybody does know, and you can type that into the chat box too, and we can have this be a conversation, certainly, where other people are answering things too.
That sounds great. While we look to see what happens there, Rick wants to know, are bird counts in the coffee lands of Mexico and Central America improving, or is sun coffee production expanding and continuing to decrease habitat?
Yeah, great question. And this topic, the name of this conversation today being coffee and conservation, it wasn't intended to be all about coffee, but I'm glad you brought it up because that's something that is an important consideration. So quote unquote, our birds that we're seeing here right now, and actually up behind me, you'll see a poster that it's part of a program that we have here around maple syrup production and making sure that maple sugar bushes are managed in ways that not only produce sap, but also and provide bird habitat. But there's up in the top there, the reason I point it, Scarlet Tanager is a bird that will come and nest here in our forest, but does spend the winter in places where there might be coffee forests and coffee plantations, along with wood thrush and many of our other birds. So I don't know, though, to answer the question about are those more open monoculture, clear the forest and plant coffee shrubs, if that's increasing or not. I will tell you that there is an extremely big difference between those kinds of that type of coffee production where forests are cleared, coffee shrubs are planted, and it's just kind of an open monoculture of nothing else. Those places we do know support very low bird diversity. So the numbers of different species we'd find there would be pretty small relative to coffee actually does grow. It's a shrub that grows in the forest setting. So this, you've heard of perhaps shade grown coffee before. That's what that's getting at is we're growing these shrubs more under a natural forest canopy. And there is a thing that you may be familiar with, which is bird friendly coffee. So it's a certification of coffee that comes from those shade grown and meets others qualifications. It's something the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center is kind of the gold standard for that certification, the bird friendly coffee. In those places, and there's a range, it's not just monoculture or shade grown, there's actually a range of conditions that coffee can be cultivated under. And as you move from the plantation, open plantation along the gradient to a natural forest, then the diversity of species of birds increases all along that gradient. So you get into the forest and you'll see a lot more birds. And again, our birds that are wintering down there. So when we do think about conservation and making sure, hey, are we gonna have scarlet tanagers and wood thrush here? We have a role to play in Vermont because this is their breeding habitat. But we have to think about full life cycle conservation and what's happening in migration for those birds and their wintering grounds, and coffee plantations are an important part of that. So we can all, with our coffee, look for that. And I will admit this is not bird-friendly coffee today because I have been, during this time, I've been trying to support some of my local coffee roasters here. So it is socially responsible coffee, but it's not bird-friendly. But that is an option. You can order that online. Birds and Beans is one. Audubon also has a bird-friendly coffee. So it's definitely helpful. It's something we can do to support bird conservation, even if we're not landowners, we can't manage land, but we can do something about where those birds are wintering by supporting those coffee growers that are part of a program.
Great. I'm going to go back to our birds eating other birds. So
Yeah.
I didn't know it's many birds eat other birds, but not their own species. So like hawks will eat, other small birds. Kristen notes that she can speculate, this is from Kristen from the Birds of Vermont Museum, that gulls or raptors might eat others young under certain circumstances. I would suspect that only those birds that are omnivores or prey on other bird species could do this. But she says she's not an ornithologist, but it's some good thoughts there.
Yeah, thanks, Kirsten.
Okay, let's get back to some questions. I had to scroll down. So, so Sam has a little problem with a robin that attacked their picture window and messed the porch up with his deposits, he notes. They've covered the window with brown paper and it stopped on that window, but now it's moved to another window. Any suggestions on how to get him to stop that are safe and harmless to him?
Well, it sounds like you're off to the right tactics because what we're experiencing, what you're experiencing there, and I'm sure there are other people who have experienced this. This is the time of year when some birds will fly repeatedly at a window. It could be on your house. 2 years ago, my truck side mirror was the chosen offender that a robin for a week or more just would not let it go, relentlessly smashing into it. So what's happening is these are, most likely these are males of the species that they are trying to establish, or they have established their territory, their breeding territory, and they're trying to keep other birds of their species out of that territory. So that robin thinks there is another robin competitor that has come in and is trying to move it away by going at it. It just happens to be that it's seeing itself and going at itself and against the window. So there's a variety of, putting something up that blocks that reflection so the bird can't see itself is helpful, and it sounds like it worked in one situation. People will hang things like old CDs. I know that's kind of an outdated thing, so all CDs might be old now, but you can hang those out and they on the outside and they'll spin around in the breeze, and that light flashing off of it might be enough to deter the bird from wanting to come by. There are silhouettes of birds of prey that people have put on. I don't know if there's one that has proven better than another. I know, speaking of the Birds of Vermont Museum, which is our neighbors and friends down the road from the Audubon Center, they put some mesh up over their windows so that the birds can't be slapping against that hard surface. And I don't know, maybe Kirsten can talk to that too, the success of that. So I don't have a solution other than, I think, understanding the problem or the issue and why it's happening is number one. It sounds like we already know the answer to that. So anything that would help to prevent the reflection from happening or not permit the bird to be able to get to that window to harm itself or make a mess all over the deck there underneath it. Using some of the methods that we just described would be my place to go. This isn't directly related to that, but I'll just mention it anyway because it's a big issue in more urban areas right now during migration, is this concept of lights out. It's something where when birds are migrating at night, as we mentioned before, they are often drawn to lights that they might see. And in many urban settings, that can be pretty devastating for birds, crashing into those windows. So there's a lot of campaigns around encouraging people. Now, around your house, it's not going to make that big of a difference, but in urban settings, again, to turn lights out at night. Don't leave those lights on in those big, tall buildings because of the fact that things are going to very possibly be crashing into them, and that would be the end of that migration for that individual. So just another window oriented point there.
Great, great. Another question about birds kind of influencing our actions or around our houses. Becky has a robin that's built a nest above an entrance of what's been a vacant apartment, and now they want to work on that apartment and it's ready for new tenants, and obviously the mama bird is pretty upset, and she wants to know, is it safe and legal to try and move it?
Yeah, unfortunately it is not legal to move nests, particularly of migratory species, which robins would fit into that category. There's for good reason, there are pretty stringent laws against having impacts on migratory birds, thankfully, but also in this case, unfortunately, because you do want to use that, but it is not legal to go and move that nest to a new location. And so I don't know what the solution is for you in this case to have new tenants moving in. I assume there's no other entrance to use for the time being to get into that space, but otherwise you simply simply alert the tenants that moving in to the fact that there are robins there, which is really cool, but be aware of that and wait a few weeks here until they are able to have their young, which they may have a couple different clutches, a couple different times they'll lay eggs in that nest, but eventually that activity will have moved on, the young will have moved on, and then things can get back to normal there.
Okay. Michael wants to know, should Phragmites be controlled or left unmanaged in a bird habitat? And I would expand that to, what about other invasives? What's the thought on that in birds?
Yeah, good question. One that's coming up more and more today in all areas, but in Vermont in particular, especially southern Vermont, but now continuing to move north all the way up through the state. These non-native plants many times become invasive. So non-native means it's not a plant that we typically would have found here in Vermont. It gets brought here through a variety of means. Wasn't all that long ago that certain things like autumn olive were promoted as being good for wildlife because they produce a fruit. Those things were encouraged to be planted, and we now, it's a non-native. So now it becomes invasive in some places, which many of these plants do. Non-native and invasive, kind of two different things. Invasive means that it's a plant that ends up really taking over a particular area and excluding other vegetation from being able to grow there. And the reason it does that is because many of these are very prolific cedars. They have a fruit often that is abundant, and unfortunately birds will eat those fruits in many cases, and they'll then transport the seed somewhere else and deposit it, and that helps a new occurrence of that plant grow. So any non-native plant will be used by birds, whether it's birds nesting in a honeysuckle or eating its berries. Birds will use them. That doesn't mean that it's a good thing or that it's desirable. It's actually not desirable. So a couple of reasons. One, we do know the research shows us that there are many fewer native insects that use non-native plants, which kind of makes sense. And insects this time of year and right through the middle of the summer is the predominant food source for a lot of these songbirds in particular. So if we have a lot of non-native plants across the landscape, we're going to have fewer insects that will help support and feed those adults and also the young that they're trying to produce here. The other aspect of non-native plants is that some of them, I won't say all, but because there's some uncertainty and conflicting evidence in the literature, are not as nutritionally valuable for birds. So when those fruits become ripe late summer and into early fall is just when our migrant birds are getting ready to head south, and they're starting to really fuel themselves up, eating a lot of food to add body mass, and the fruit that they're eating is an important part of that. So some fruits, birds are not processing, they're not getting the same nutritional quality out of them. Things like buckthorn have chemicals in them that basically go right through the system of a bird, so they don't really absorb anything out of it. So whether it's, Phragmites is another one that grows, tends to be more in wetter areas along ponds, wet fields, things like that. It's desirable to try to control those non-natives as much as you can, and there are a variety of methods for doing that. There's a great website, vtinvasives.org, that lists pretty much all of the non-native plants that you might find in Vermont and provides control measures. We used to use this word, and some people still might, to eradicate these plants. I believe that we are, for the most part, beyond total eradication and getting rid of them completely from the landscape. I think we're now in a management and a control mode where we're trying to minimize the spread to new areas. And if you have a piece of land and all of a sudden you notice this, what's that plant over there in the forest understory? It's got some little red fruits hanging from it. It's got thorns all over it growing low to the ground. It's a Japanese barberry, most likely. And if you only have one, now's the time to address it so that it doesn't spread to other areas of your property. So controlling it the best you can, especially when you have minimal amounts of it, now's the time to get out there.
Great, thanks. There's a few people, Julia, Tricia, Linda, all had similar questions. For those with, smaller yards, or they want to improve habitat in their yard for birds, what can they do? What 5 native shrubs would be beneficial to attract birds? They just really want to improve where they are for birds. What can they do?
Yeah. Well, first, thank you for wanting to do that. Second, there's, and I'll get to some specifics here in just a moment, but I want to also point you to another resource online. It's another Audubon resource called Plants for Birds. And if you just Google that, you'll be taken to it. It's a really awesome website because you can put in your zip code and it will give you a list of native plants that would be appropriate for your locale. It will go also as far as giving you either the choice to select this or just to see what kinds of birds am I looking to support. Am I interested in supporting thrushes, sparrows, finches? What is it that I'm trying to provide a food source for? And it will then narrow that list down even a little bit more to native plants in your area that produce something that's good for those groups of birds. So it's pretty awesome. And also will go as far as, I think in most cases, it'll give you the name and contact of a local nursery where you can go and find those things, which is also awesome. So some of the main things, anything that's a native fruit producer. So the dogwoods are great shrubs to plant. High bush cranberries are another one. Service berries, nanny berry. There's anything that has this berry to it. Even blueberries will be eaten. Raspberries and blackberries. All of these native shrubs that produce a fruit. Many of them will be used by some bird at some point in the year. So those are some examples, and I would again point you to the Plants for Birds website to get some much more extensive list of things for your specific location.
Okay, there's a question about not cutting trees or cutting trees. Is it okay to cut trees if I want to improve habitat for birds? It
is, and that's, there's an understandable thought that the best thing that we could do for wildlife and for the environment is to just let it do its thing. Leave it alone, because nature knows how to take care of itself. And you're right if you think that, because it does know how to take care of itself, and it does not need people to necessarily do that. Having said that, however, people have been here for quite a while, and the things that we have done have altered that landscape quite a bit. So we can do things now, even though the forest may not need it. We can do things that can help make the forest or whatever other type of habitats you have better places. We're trying to restore them in some cases from some of the past activities that we've applied to them. So among those in a forest is, someone mentioned early on that we have these, a lot of our forests in Vermont are what we call even-aged forests, where there's basically, even age means essentially all of the trees or the majority of trees in that forest are all within maybe 20 years of age of each other. Many times when you're standing there, you can tell that. I mean, the trees are all essentially the same height. They might be 60, 80 feet tall, and there might be some other trees in the mid canopy or shrubs growing on the ground, but probably not a lot of them. And that's a remnant of our past land use. So what's Vermont's forest cover today? It's about 78% of the state covered in forest. It wasn't that long ago, 100 plus years, if that, where it was reversed, where only about 20% of Vermont was forested and the rest of it was open. And that was land that was cleared for agriculture. Many cases it was for sheep grazing. Sheep, at one point, sheep outnumbered people in Vermont. And when those farms were let go and those fields were left go from being pastured, they do what the land does in the New England. It turns back to forest. So that even age forest kind of came in, and in time, naturally, we'll see a change happen. If we wait for a forest to be 100 to 150 years old, trees will grow big. Some will die because they get shaded out. Big trees will grow big crowns, and someday a big wind event will come and there goes that tree down. You've now got a big hole in the canopy of the forest. Sunlight comes in, new trees grow. So that's kind of how our forests naturally would work. But we have to wait for that. And in the meantime, birds are declining in population. We need forest products in our day-to-day lives. As a matter of fact, what a great example in toilet paper today. How people are looking for toilet paper, it's a forest product. And so managing the forest for these multiple benefits, habitat, things that we need is important. It doesn't have to happen everywhere, but it is an important part of the mix of what's going on out there. So that is a long-winded way, and I can be long-winded, so I apologize, of saying yes, cutting trees is a good thing in the right situation with the right goals and objectives that we have for what we're doing to enhance habitat and also to get the things, the wood, the fiber for the products that we all use and need every day. It's very important, though, to make sure that you seek out professional guidance to help you with that, to have a plan for what that's going to look like rather than just going outside. I'm just going to start cutting a bunch of trees on my property. You could do that, of course, but you might not get the result in the end that you're looking for.
Okay. Follow up on that, and I do want everybody to know I'm working my way through the chat box, so hang in there. I will get to your question. Margaret was wondering about the age of forests and biodiversity. She was on a recent webinar where someone spoke about wildlife species richness and its highest in older forests, and went on to say that younger forest is not needed for biodiversity and the benefits of mature trees add the, that is an additional reason to keep older forests thriving. What's your thought on that?
Oh boy, this is great. These are the things that I spend my days thinking about. This kind of topic. I'll say I don't quite understand the messaging that younger forests lack, if that was what the point was made, lack diversity. Because young forests often will have, and there's a lot of evidence, scientific evidence to show, have some of the highest diversity of many forest conditions that are out there. And then you go through, so young forest, I mentioned this earlier, this young forest or early successional habitat. Typically it's a time frame that goes from year 2 or 3 after whatever this disturbance was that created it, wind event, ice storm, harvest, up until 15 to 20 years after that disturbance. That's the period of time when we have this real dense low growth. There's a lot of species of birds in there, and there's a lot of other wildlife too that use that. Then we go into, in the geeky forestry terminology, a period of growth we call stem exclusion stage of a forest. Basically, that's a fancy way to say you get these even age forests with little understory growth. There's not big trees, there's not big dead trees on the ground or standing. Those forests tend to have the lowest value for supporting the diversity of wildlife. And then as you move towards an older forest, 100+ years, so we go from essentially 20 to 100 years, that time frame is typically natural, in a natural forest would be the lowest value for diversity. You get above 100 years, now you start to see we're past that stem exclusion, and we're into now the understory reinitiation phase where big trees fall down, sunlight gets on the forest floor, and new trees grow up in there. And now we start to add diversity back in there as the forest matures and gets older. So kind of the two ends of the spectrum, if you will. Young forests and later successional forests have the greater diversity. And that mid-range is when it's going to be lowest. But young forests definitely have a lot of diversity, a lot of biodiversity. So the question that often comes up is, what's the best way to balance that young forest on the land compared to the older forest that's on the land? And there are guidelines, recommendations for that. It all comes down many times to objectives, but what a landowner's objectives might be for their land. But Audubon Vermont suggests that for forests, we have on our landscape somewhere between 3 to 5% of that landscape be in these young forests, 0 to 20-year-old forests at any given time. And that's relative to somewhat mimicking the way nature would do things. If we weren't here and over hundreds of years, how does the forest naturally create those conditions? So it creates about that much, even a little bit less than that in the northern hardwood forests of Vermont. But we have a 3 to 5% starting point to consider that question.
Great, great. And I can also mention the Vermont Conservation Design is it's a map really, but it's sort of a program that's looked at what do we have and what do we need to maintain here in Vermont to keep the diversity of wildlife that we enjoy so much. How much do we need in early succession? How much do we need in mid and late succession? So that's another resource that people can go look at.
Yeah, and that's great. Thanks for bringing that up, Lisa, because that statewide, that same 3 to 5% recommendation is there. And then you can break it out by what we call biophysical regions of Vermont. So specific areas of the state, it'll give you a more specific range. So some places might be 1 to 2%, other places might be more of 5% as a target to shoot for based on where you are. So great resource.
September's asked a question. She wants to know, what is the most popular bird in Vermont?
Well, the most popular bird in Vermont, I'm going to have to say it's the state bird. Does anybody know what that is? Type it in. Type it in.
The hermit thrush. The hermit thrush.
That's right. Yep, the hermit thrush is our state bird. And they're here. They're back. Of course, I've been noticing quite a few of those around as well. I don't know. I mean, that's my initial reaction to that question is simply for that reason. I don't know. I guess it's the most popular is based on who you're asking, where you might be.
That's right.
No, that would be the more question like, what's the best bird would be based on who you are and who you ask. So my answer is the hermit thrush. I'll stick with it.
Okay, great. Lily wants to know, how come there are songbirds that don't really make pretty sounds?
Sound beauty is in the in the ear of the listener, I guess, maybe. But no, you're right. Like the wood thrush. We're gonna try this out. Bear with me for a second. So I'm using my my Audubon app on my phone here, a free app that you can get. And I'm going to just play it for you. Hopefully you'll hear it so that you can understand what I would describe as a very beautiful song. You hear that? So it's this flute-like, it's just a beautiful song from my perspective. Whereas some other bird, let me think of one here and find it. I don't know. I think this is kind of nice too, but. You hear that?
That one's really hard to hear.
It's hard to hear. It's a high pitch, just kind of a almost sounds like sleigh bells. I think it's kind of nice as well, but it's not definitely the same as the wood thrush. This is a black-poll warbler. Black-poll warblers, we'd have to go during the breeding season. You have to go up high in elevation, up Mount Mansfield or Camel's Hump or the Northeast Kingdom in the spruce fir forest to hear that. But it's really, what's the purpose of songs? Really, I guess is the question. And those songs are used by birds. It's typically the male who sings, and the male sings that song for two main reasons. One is to define his territory, his breeding territory, so that other males know that a specific area has already been claimed. And the other is to attract a mate, to attract a female. Hopefully for nesting with and producing young of their species. So it's simply a matter of, I should never say simply, because nothing's simple when it comes to this stuff. It's how we ascribe it. It's each species has its own unique song And where that song, how it developed, I haven't the faintest idea. So why does the blackpoll warbler just have that sound song and the wood thrush is more flute-like and maybe more pleasant to listen to? I don't really have an answer to that, but it is, certainly there are extreme differences between different species and their songs, but they're doing it for that particular, those purposes of attracting mate and defining territories.
Great. Holden wants to know why blue jays are bullies.
Holden, why are blue jays bullies? They're just by nature a little bit more gregarious or aggressive and out to do what they need to do, I guess. They're I don't think that they're thinking of themselves as bullies. They're simply making sure that they're able to get at the feeder to get the food that they want. So it may seem like they're bullyish to us from their perspective, and other birds who probably don't know the emotion or the action of bullying. It's more of, I'm doing what I need to do in order to survive. And that's what any of these birds are doing. They're out there, they're not thinking about how they may be affecting others. It's a survival thing. And all actions that birds and wildlife are doing are really typically around surviving and reproducing young and keeping their species going.
Great. Samantha wants to know, will songbirds return to their nests? And I would say, in general, which birds, do some return to the nests and some don't? How does that work?
Yeah. So birds typically do return to the same general location for nesting each year. So we know this through close to home example is at our Green Mountain Audubon Center. My colleague, Mark Labar, who some of you may have seen on TV and other places, he is a bird bander. So what that means is that he sets up these nets that they basically look like volleyball nets or badminton nets at certain places in the forest, but it's a very fine mesh to that net. And birds won't see them and they'll fly into them, and then he can go around and collect them and bring them back and collect data, measure wing lengths and things like that, weigh them. And then each bird gets a little aluminum band, lightweight aluminum band attached to its leg with a unique number, identification number on it. And that will stay on there. And so then he releases them. When we then catch a bird next summer and we see, hey, this bird has a band, and we look at the number and we see that we go back into our notes and we see that number matches a bird that I banded last year. So here's the same bird in the same net that I caught it last year. So that tells us that birds are coming back. They're using the same general vicinity. Whether or not they use the same nest really is dependent upon the species. So for some, particularly those birds that put their nests out in areas that are going to get hammered hard by weather and tend to get beat up, they don't use the same nest. So they'll rebuild a nest, but they'll do it in a relatively same general area. Other birds, like the eastern phoebe that I mentioned earlier, that is nesting in the barn under the eaves, it is using the same nest, and it's kind of adding mud and moss to it. Bald eagles, osprey, like those kinds of nests will get used, and they get added on year after year. And that's why some of these big stick nests that you'll see get so huge and heavy, because they're being used repeatedly and being added to. So it really depends on the species whether they reuse the nest, but many of the birds will, in general, come back to the same area to try to nest.
Excellent, excellent. Holden has another question. He has a woodpecker and he doesn't know what food it likes, and it's a red-bellied woodpecker. Can you give him some tips on what they might like to eat?
Yep, so red-bellied woodpeckers, that's kind of a neat one, because that's a bird that, and it was Holden, correct? Yep. Not sure where you're at, Holden, but that's a bird that we didn't really see a whole lot of in Vermont until the last maybe 10 years or so. And it started creeping into southern Vermont, and now it's moved its way up through the Champlain Valley and into other parts of the state, because that's typically a bird of more southern areas. So that is pointing to, is a changing climate, making conditions more suitable for some birds to expand their range northward. But to the question, most of our woodpeckers are insect eaters. So they rely upon finding insects, particularly in either dead trees, standing trees, which we call snags, or even in live trees that have insects in them boring around. So that when you see woodpeckers going to trees and tapping on them, sometimes it's to excavate a nest cavity, or it might be to, since they don't sing, that's their way to communicate, is tapping on trees, drumming. And other times it's to look for those insect foods. So in the wintertime, with our woodpeckers that stick around, suet, which is fat, animal fat essentially, with seeds put in it that you can get, is often one of the most preferred foods for woodpeckers.
Great. Are there certain types of nesting materials or food that birds especially like? This comes from Lewin.
Lewin, certain nesting materials and foods. So remember, we mentioned a little bit ago that insects are a really important and critical food source for the majority of these birds. And that would be everything from the larvae or the caterpillars of moths and butterflies to mosquitoes and black flies. That's what our flycatchers like to go after. They fly out and grab those adult insects on the wing. But also spiders and ants, things that are down in the leaf litter on the ground in the forest floor. Of course, then birds of prey are feeding on small mammals, snakes, even songbirds. So there's a wide range of things, and then other birds really eat more exclusively seeds and berries. So it's a wide range of things that they'll feed on. It's really based on the species. In terms of nesting materials, birds use what they have in their area that they're trying to nest in. So they'll go out and search for those materials, and this too can range very widely. Sometimes when people brush their long-haired dog and throw that hair outside or fur outside, birds will use that to put in their nest. But grasses and sticks and mud, bits of yarn I've seen in nests that birds have found. It's not saying we should put that out there for them to use, but they'll use what they can find around them typically. And nests are vary widely too, based on the species, from essentially nothing for some of our ground nesting birds like a woodcock or a turkey. There's not much to the nest on the ground, whereas an oriole has a very elaborate hanging basket nest on the branch of a tree. So it ranges quite a bit.
Great.
Lisa, I noticed we're up against our 10 o'clock.
We
time.
are. I want to ask one last question and then wrap up, because I think this is a really important question. It comes from Erica. Are cats as big a threat as folks are saying, or are they more scapegoats because they're easier to blame than looking at our practices / destruction? I know they're a threat, but how much are they really?
Yeah, well, I can speak to the evidence that's out there, and the American Bird Conservancy, I think, is one of the groups that has done a lot of research on this, and their estimates are that 2.2, oh gosh, now it's either, I think it's billion, or maybe it's million. There's obviously a wide difference there, but nonetheless, it's a large number of birds are taken by outdoor cats, and that's not just feral or wild cats. It's also our pets that are outside. So it is a real issue. And I don't think that that they're just scapegoats for other things. I mean, there's so many things going on, that many of which are related to humans, that are influencing the ability of birds to persist on the landscape. But cats is certainly among them, among the things that are out there. And, it's hard to think that your pet would be doing that. But if it is out there and it's roaming around freely, especially if it doesn't have anything on it to help alert its presence to birds, there are some great collars that have been developed that have been shown to actually do a good job. And one of them is produced locally right here. I believe it's in Duxbury. The Bird Be Safe collar. This is not an infomercial for Bird Be Safe, but I know that it's something that's proven itself. It's brightly colored, it has bells on it, and has worked. So it's an important question. It's an important thing to consider that, in fact, yes, cats are part of the problem. Are they the biggest problem? I don't know that. Some would say yes. I won't go that far.
Okay, great. Thanks, Steve. There are still more questions in the chat box. I'm going to put your email in there, and people can email you a few questions if they have further questions that aren't answered. And I'll let you give a quick wrap up.
Yeah.
And then we'll say goodbye to everybody. It's been great, but let Steve wrap it up. And
yeah, thanks, Lisa, and thank you all for joining. It's been great. There's been a lot of folks here. Really appreciate that. Hopefully answered a lot of the questions that we had. I just want to put in one announcement for Audubon. We are getting into, this is the time of year when we typically do our biggest fundraiser called Bird-A-Thon, which is when the staff would typically get together and spend a full day out birding. We typically would do this at our Green Mountain Audubon Center, and then get on bikes and travel through Huntington and Richmond, recording every bird that we see and or hear. And we get people to sponsor us to help fund our programs that we offer to Vermonters on education, conservation, and the public policy work that we do. This year, things are obviously a little different. We're inviting all of you to virtually join us in birding and to join a team. One of the Audubon staff or board members join their team and go out. It's going to be during the period of, say, May 16th, so this coming Saturday through the 25th. Go out for 24 hours, not continual, but 24 hours during that time, piece together those hours, and record everything that you observe and share that with us online. And if you are in a place where you can and you see fit to also help support us financially, especially during this time, we would appreciate that as well. The place to find that, simply go to Google Audubon Vermont Bird-A-Thon 2020, and you'll find a link to that page. So I just wanted to kind of put that in there for folks that would be interested in either join us for birding, join my team. My team is we try to come up with creative names. So the Yellow-Bellied (maple) sapsuckers. And I put the maple in there because I'm a maple producer, make maple syrup. So sapsuckers draw sap from trees, and so do I for making maple syrup. So join the Yellow-Bellied maple sapsuckers and get out there and bird and see what you find. And that, in the end, is really the best thing we can do, and have fun with it.
Great, Steve. Thank you. Vermont Coverts and Vermont Woodlands Association, thanks you all for joining us today. Again, you can get some of our e-newses by signing up on our website. Join, donate. We appreciate any support we can get so we can continue to bring programs like this to you. I'm going to turn it over and let Kathleen say a goodbye as well. And thank you all.
Yep, thank you all for being here. You know, I would mention that one of the things Vermont Woodlands is doing right now is a weekly challenge for some of our students who are not in school and looking for things to do in the woods. So it's Into the Woods. There's an Instagram page and a Facebook page. I'm not very well versed on that, but Google those and check on our weekly challenge. We're having winners drawn every week and sending out prizes too. So Into the Woods, Vermont.
Yeah, do it. Get out there.
Thanks all.
Excellent.
All right.
Bye all. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Bye.